All right, good evening. So we are moving right along in the 10 Commandments, the Aseres HaDibros, and today we're going to talk about number 4. And number 4 is the observance of Shabbos or Shabbat and or Sabbath. So many things you could call it. I'm excited about this class because I love Shabbos, and I love talking about Shabbos, and I have some old ideas to share with you that I've shared in the past, some new ideas. So we'll get into it. Rabbi Mordechai Becher, who's a prominent speaker, he tells. It's funny to say something about someone who tells a story about themselves, but he tells an apocryphal story about himself. In that you never know if these stories are true, but because he's a funny guy, it's like he's almost a comedian. So he tells the story of when he was once staying in a hotel on the 11th floor on Shabbos. And since it was Shabbos, he couldn't use the elevator. So he had to use the staircase to get to his room on the 11th floor. So he starts climbing story after story until finally he gets to the 11th floor. He's sweating, he's out of breath, and he opens the door and he walks out, and just as he walks out of the staircase, there's someone coming out of the elevator, and the person looks at him and says, how come you took the stairs? Why didn't you just take the elevator? So wheezing, barely able to talk, sweating, he responds, because today is the Jewish Sabbath. It's my day of rest. So the story really raises an important question, which is if it's truly a day of rest, then why would we have to climb 11 stories rather than just simply take the elevator? Or why would we have to walk somewhere instead of just driving somewhere? Why do the laws of Shabbos actually make us sometimes work harder than we would have to otherwise, if in fact it is supposed to be a day of rest? So we'll have to really try to examine that. Is it really a day of rest is the first question. And the truth is, it is. We do find certainly in the liturgy, in the prayers of Shabbos, the songs of Shabbos, we refer to it as a Yom Menucha, a day of rest. The Torah, I don't know if it ever actually calls it a day of rest. It may. I didn't look around so much because it talks about Shabbos in a lot of different places. The verses that we're going to look at never actually refers it to as a day of rest. It does mention sometimes in order that you will rest, or that your animals or that your servants will rest. But so that's what we'll have to try to get further into that. We have to ask, what exactly are we resting from, if it isn't indeed a day of rest? So I'm going to bring up just the basic verses from the 10 Commandments, where we are commanded to observe Shabbos, and we'll take a look there, and then we'll try to work from there. So in the 10 Commandments, we read as follows: remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. So Zachor, remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. Zachor es Yom HaShabbos. 6 days may you work and perform all your labor, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. So it's a Sabbath, it's a break of some sort for God. You shall perform no labor, neither you, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, your animal, nor a stranger is in your cities. For in 6 days, and then it gives the reason. What is the reason? For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it. So in the 10 Commandments itself, number 4 of the 10 Commandments is to remember the Sabbath. And then it elaborates and it explains that on the 7th day you shall perform no labor. And it gives the reason being, for in 6 days, God made the heaven and the earth, and he rested on the seventh day. So because God rested on the seventh day, therefore he blessed it and sanctified it. So what exactly are we saying here? What is the reason that we're to keep Shabbos? Is it to remember that God rested on the seventh day? Is it perhaps to remember that God created the world? Because we also refer to that here. For in 6 days, the Lord made the heaven and the earth. And on the seventh day, he rested. So which one is it? What are we remembering? Are we remembering that God created the world? Are we remembering that he rested on the seventh day? Or perhaps we're remembering both? What does it mean that God rested even? Was God out of breath when he got to the 11th floor? When he got to the seventh day, he said, whew, that was a tough 6 days. I need to take a breath. I need to take a break. I need to take a rest, right? Certainly not. So what do we even mean that God rested on the seventh day? And if in fact we're to remember that God created the world, if that's what we're trying to remember, which is certainly going to be a very important part of Shabbos, is to remember that God created the world, then perhaps it would be more fitting that we create on Shabbos and not cease to create, right? We should get out our model clay or our building blocks, and every Shabbos we should create we should paint a globe. We should make a world. I don't know, right? We should make something creative on Shabbos. But yeah, as we're about to learn, on Shabbos, we actually cease from doing anything creative. But if we're trying to remember that God created the world, maybe we should actually be engaging in creative activities to commemorate that. So these are all questions that we're going to try to explore. What is it that we're remembering? What are we resting from? What does it mean that God rested? Because that will tell us maybe what we're resting from. And why are we resting? Why aren't we creating on the seventh day if we want to commemorate and remember that God created the world? So when we talk about what we are permitted to do, what we're not permitted to do on Shabbos, so where do we even know the laws of Shabbos from? If you look in the Ten Commandments, it just said, cease to do labor. Well, please tell me what exactly is included in that, because there could be lots of things that are included in that, or lots of things that are not included in it. How do we know exactly what are the prohibitions of Shabbos? So the truth is, actually, I should bring that back up, because we have a great source. The 39 melachos, the 39 forbidding acts of Shabbos, are all derived from the building of the tabernacle, of the Mishkan, the portable temple that they had in the desert. And this is just the list. We're not going to learn them in detail. So for example, in order to build the temple, it involved creating dyes, and that would involve plants. So there was sowing and plowing and reaping and gathering and binding and threshing and winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking. So those are all included in the 39. Those are all prohibited actions on Shabbos. And then they had to make curtains. So there was shearing wool and cleaning it and combing it and dyeing it and spinning it, etc., etc. There was writing, erasing, building, breaking down, extinguishing fires, kindling fires, etc. So there are many, many acts involved in the creation of the tabernacle, creative acts that were necessary to create the tabernacle, the Mishkan. And the Torah teaches us, we derive this from verses, never says it explicitly, but the juxtaposition of the command to observe Shabbos with the command to build the tabernacle, we derive that is the source. Obviously, there was a tradition as such going back to Sinai, but also that's where we can actually see it in the verses, that this is where we look to discover what it is that we are to refrain from. How do we rest on Shabbos? We refrain from these actions. We seize these actions, these acts. And the truth is, of course, there's much to discuss what's included in each category. There's 39 categories, and there are, many important works that break them down further and explain exactly what's included and what's not in each of those categories. But I want to just ask a very important but obvious and basic question is, why is it that we look towards the building of the tabernacle, of the Mishkan, to define for ourselves what it is that we cannot do on Shabbos? What does one have to do with the other? Why is the template that we look to for what to refrain from on Shabbos all the acts that were done to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the moving temple from the desert? I mean, we could have gone anywhere, all the acts that were used to travel, all the acts that were used, I don't know, it could have been anything, right? What is it that's special? What is it about the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the building of the tabernacle? What's the connection between that and Shabbos, that's where we derive how our Shabbos is really supposed to look like? Because that's really what it boils down to. If we look past, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that, that may be true, but what we're really creating is a atmosphere. We're creating an atmosphere, and where we turn to learn how to create that atmosphere is the building of the Mishkan, of the temple, or really the cessation, the stopping of building that temple, that Mishkan. And my question is, why do we look there? So the answer, or one answer, is actually very beautiful, but very deep. So you'll have to bear with me as we delve a little deep. And this answer comes from Rabbi David Foreman. Anybody's ever been to aleph-beta.com, I think that's the website, or .org. It's a great website, great short videos with cartoons always, but very, despite, it's not just for kids, it's adult information, and very engaging Torah source, Aleph Beta. So Rabbi David Foreman says that in order to really understand why we look to the building of the tabernacle, to understand Shabbos and what the atmosphere of Shabbos is supposed to look like, really to understand it, we have to go all the way back to the creation of the world and examine it from a bit of a Kabbalistic perspective. So we got to get into Kabbalah a little bit. So we have to ask a question. You go back to before time, we're actually not supposed to think too much about it, but what was the significance of God creating the world? So obviously it was very significant, right? The act of creating the world was the most dramatic change to the status quo to ever occur. Before there was nothing, and then God created the world, and there was something from nothing, right? There's nothing more dramatic, nothing more significant than that. But the truth is that that's only true from our perspective. Before the world was created, there's nothing, but after the world is created, there's everything. There's a world, there's existence. But it's not really the case from God's perspective. From God's point of view, what was the significance of creation? So are you going to say, what do you mean? Before God created the world, there was nothing. Afterwards, there was something, right? Well, no, not quite, right? Before God created the world, there was everything. There was God, and God was the only existence, but God is the only absolute existence. There was everything. And trust me, God was doing just fine without having created the world, dwelling in his tremendous realm, and wherever that is, right? But from God's point of view, creation didn't make everything, that before there was nothing and now there is everything. And the truth is that it's almost the opposite. In a certain sense, from God's point of view, the creation of the world was a diminishment. It's what the Kabbalists call tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means contraction. And there's different ways to understand it, but just on a basic level, right? If God is the only absolute existence, and then he's all that exists, and then he could create a place where not everybody sees him and not everybody always senses him. So he's now almost like taking himself away from somewhere. He's all that exists at first. And now there's a place that exists that almost, so to speak, exists without God there, because not that he's not there, but that there could be a person could live without sensing him there. It's almost as if God diminished himself when he created the world. Another way that the Kabbalists describe Tzimtzum, which is contraction, which is, again, it's hard to, these are concepts that we can only try to speak about, but that, if God is everything and fills the whole world, or there's no world before, is the only existence, and then he allows for another, the creation of a world and of an existence, of a physical existence for mankind. So what he's doing is in a certain sense like contracting himself, making a space for other things to exist. And the question is, why would God have done this? And that's a question that we can't, again, get to the core answer of why God does what he does. But we've spoken many times that from our perspective, the way we understand it is God did it in order to do good, in order to bestow of his goodness upon a creature, a creation, and that would be mankind. And so God wants to create a being, a child, for a separate being that would have free will, that he could form a relationship with, and that could form a relationship with God. But that being couldn't exist in just God's world. That being has to have a world of its own, a new environment. If that being existed in like a realm where God was close and obvious and clear, there's no free will then. If God is as clear as day to us, then without any tests, then there's no free will. God had to create sort of an atmosphere, a habitat for mankind to exist, for this creation to exist, where that person or that creation would be tested, where God could be hidden. And so God creates, and that in a certain sense is the most miraculous part of creation. That's really what the Kabbalists are getting at, this tzimtzum, this contraction, where God could create a place, a space for mankind to dwell with himself hidden somewhat. And it's for us it's our test to find him and make a relationship with him within this habitat, within this world that he's made for us. Now, this process that we're describing, where God is all that exists, and then it creates sort of a bubble where a world can exist and mankind can develop, is very similar to a baby in a womb, right? So a womb is a space within a human being that isn't there for themselves. It's not there for the mother. The womb isn't there for the mother. Everything else in our bodies, all of our organs, etc., are for us. They're to serve us, to service us, to help us breathe, to help us eat, to help us consume, go to the bathroom, whatever it is, right? All our organs are there for us, to nourish ourselves, except for one body part, or multiple parts that make up a mother's ability to have a child, to have a womb. And that womb is created, so to speak. It's there really for creation, to create an environment to nourish something else within it. And that's sort of what God creates within himself. It's like a womb within himself. He creates a space. He creates a world where mankind can exist and mankind can develop. He doesn't do it for himself. He doesn't need this. God is outside of this world, outside of these constructs of space and time, and this is there just for us. And finally, after God spends 6 days creating this place, this world. So on the seventh, at the end of the sixth day, or in the middle of the sixth day, God then creates that child, mankind, Adam and then Eve, Adam and Chava. And it says that God creates them in his image. And what does that mean, in his image? It means that man is created in a certain way to be similar to God. We've spoken about different ideas of what that might mean. But what we can say today, what is it about us that is godlike? Well, God has been creating this whole time, the last 6 days, a world, an environment that's perfectly calibrated for the human being that he's going to place inside. It's designed for him, it's not designed for God, it's designed for us, for the people that he's going to place inside. And the being that he creates also has the power to create, both in terms of producing offspring, but also, as we'll discuss more, in terms of creating environment for God, really. And we know, we've spoken about, that one of the main ways that we draw near to God, that we do form a relationship with him, is by behaving similarly to God, by emulating God. So one of the ways that we can emulate God is to create an environment for him, just as God spends 6 days and creates an environment for mankind and then puts him into it. He creates this habitat called Earth, but really much more than that, in existence, that's all designed for man. So too, we can emulate that and create an environment and creating existence. And that's going to be sort of what the Mishkan, what the tabernacle is, as we'll touch on in a moment. So God brings everything into existence, and really many commentaries understand that at the beginning of creation, God just created almost like what's described as the Big Bang nowadays, but God created material, God created something, and then, this is the medieval commentators already talk about this, Rashi, Ramban, God then took what he had created and developed it into each day into different things. And each day of creation was all drawn, everything was already existing, and then God formed it over the rest of the 6 days. And that process was melacha, was work. This thing that we talk about with regards to Shabbos, it was melacha. It was the process of deciding with his mind what he wants and then acting to make it so. So it was deliberate action of forming, of creating, using the materials that were there. And man engages in that too. We take the materials of the world and we create with them. And we create the environment that suits us. We create the environment that we want. That's called melacha, using the materials of the world to create something. But it's not only that we can take the materials of the world and do melacha, do work, creative actions to create an environment or a home or a palace or a skyscraper just for ourselves. But we can also be godlike and create it for another. So we could create it for others, but we could create an environment like that for God as well. And that is the idea of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and later of the temple in Jerusalem. The idea is, and so much of the Torah really centers around this event of building the Mishkan. We have so many parshas, so many Torah portions that speak about what they used to build the Mishkan, then the actual building of the Mishkan, then what they did in the Mishkan. So much is dedicated to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle of God. And what is so significant about it? So it's a dwelling place for God. That's very significant. But on a certain level, the significance from our standpoint is it's our way of emulating, of doing what God did, of creating a version of what God created for us, just for him. What did God do when he created the universe? So first, God was all that existed. And then God says, no, wait a second. I'm going to create within me, within my one existence, absolute existence, I'm going to create a little apartment where I can put the being that I love. I could put the creation that I love into this little apartment that's called the universe. It's a teeny tiny little apartment, in comparison to God, a teeny tiny universe. And that is going to be the place, the habitat, the perfect environment for the creature, the creation that I want to make. The sages refer to this. I actually put this in the slide. This concept in Kabbalah, but also you see it elsewhere. We sometimes refer to God as Hamakom, which means the place. So when we visit a mourner, we say Hamakom Yenachem Eschem. God should comfort you. On Pesach, we read Baruch Hamakom Baruch Hu. Blessed is the place. Blessed is He. We sometimes refer to God as the place, and we have to, in each of those contexts, we can try to understand why, but not for right now. But the sages teach us, why do we sometimes refer to God as Hamakom, the place? Because God is the place of the world. The world is not his place. We don't mean possessively the world is not his place, but we mean is he doesn't dwell per se in the world. The world dwells within him. And that's the concept that I'm trying to describe, where God makes a space within himself for the universe and the world. Not that there's a world and God is somewhere in there tucked away. No. God is all that exists. And then within himself, as though absolute existence, he makes a space, so to speak, where a universe could exist. And now mankind does the same thing. We look at everything that we have, all the materials that we have, this vast universe, and we say, I'm going to make a little apartment within my universe for the one that I love, for God. Amazing. And you know what? Just like the world has certain laws of physics that are necessary for us to survive in the world, for us to exist, God makes the environment perfectly calibrated for our existence. Well, you know what? In the world that we create for God, in the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the temple that we create for God, there's also laws. If we want God to be able to dwell there, well, we've got to follow the laws of the temple. We've got to follow the guidelines set out, and the procedures and the services, the temple service, and all that is, so to speak, the physics of the temple for it to function and for it to be an environment that God will want to come and dwell in. And we do, because we want God to come and dwell in that apartment, in that temple. The sages actually teach us that the temple was representative of a mini world. And they go through how each part represents a different part of nature of the world. The ark represented one thing, and the menorah, represented something else, and all the different parts. The temple is really like a mini world. So it's a beautiful idea that just as God creates a place within himself for the one he loves, for us, he carves it out and says, this is going to be your dwelling place, that we can have a relationship. So we emulate that. We do the same thing. When we build a temple, when we build a tabernacle, what we're essentially doing is saying, out of all this vast universe that we have, we want to carve out a little place for God to dwell within. So now we see the connection, because what happens? God creates this environment for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, God stops creating that environment. He stops creating the world. So the same thing for us. We create the environment. We create the temple for 6 days. for God to dwell within. And then on the seventh day, we seize that creation. We stop those acts of creating a temple on the seventh day. So we can very clearly understand that there's a connection. We still have to, I think, develop the idea more, but there's a very clear connection between the temple and the world, and resting from the creative acts of building the Mishkan, defining our seventh day by seizing those acts, because that's what God does on the seventh day too. God creates for 6 days, creates the environment for us, the little apartment for us, the world, the universe, and seizes on the seventh day. And similarly, we do the same thing. We create the environment for God, the temple, for 6 days. And then on the seventh day, we cease creating. So it's a beautiful, beautiful connection, a beautiful idea. But we really, I think, still need to develop it a little bit more. So the question, though, is, if we're engaged in creating a dwelling place for God for 6 days, then why should we stop? Why should we stop creating that dwelling place? Maybe we should just keep going. What's the reason to stop? So there's a great story that I read, which I think really brings out the idea, the importance of stopping to create the dwelling place for God. And the story goes as follows. The story is told about a Hasidic Rebbe. Pachuch, I think, is the pronunciation. The Rebbe of Pachuch. And he once was sitting, and he just seemingly randomly cried out, "Where is that ultimate child? Where is that ultimate child?" So the people sitting near the Rebbe, they said, "What are you talking about? What are you asking about?" So he said, "I was once confronted, he once confronted a man who was very immersed in his business ventures. And the Rebbe says, I asked him, why are you so absorbed in trying to make money? Why not devote more time to prayer and Torah study, to spiritual development?" So the man said, "You see, Rabbi, I really don't need so much to live on. And I really value that. I value Torah study. I value prayer. I value spiritual development. And I really don't need all this money. But I have to work because I have to provide for my child and his future. That's why I need to work so much." So that was his answer. So years go by. The Rebbe gets a little bit older, and that child is now grown up. And the child also becomes engrossed in business and earning money. And the Rebbe, now a little bit older, he approaches the child one day, who's now a young man in his 20s, mid-20s, and he says, "Why do you spend so much time with your business? Why not spend a little more time devoted to spiritual development, to Torah study, to prayer?" And the child, now he's now 25, he says, "The truth is, Rebbe, I value that. It's really important to me. And I don't need this money for myself, but I now have a little baby and I need it for my child." Well, the Rebbe gets a little bit older, and the same thing repeats itself with that child. And so the Rebbe cries out finally, he says, "Where is that ultimate child?" He says, somewhere perhaps at the end of time, there's that ultimate child for whose welfare countless generations have toiled and neglected their own spiritual growth. We're all working for that child. He says, where is that ultimate child? Is he not but a fiction, a non-existent endpoint, an illusion that has driven the entire world into an insane striving toward futility? That's how the story is told over. And the point of the story, I think, is very valuable, is very important, and relates to exactly what we're talking about. I think this is the idea of resting of God resting from creation and our resting from building the Mishkan and our resting on Shabbos as well. God rested on the seventh day. It wasn't because he was tired. He wasn't out of breath, like we said, but he wanted to teach us that we can build and we can create all week long out of love and out of purpose. But then we have to stop. We have to cease, and we have to engage in the relationship that we're actually trying to build towards. Building the Mishkan, building the tabernacle, is an analogy for our lives. The Torah itself actually says, when God says to build the Mishkan, build the tabernacle, he says, build me a sanctuary and I will dwell amongst them. It doesn't say I'll dwell in it. It says I'll dwell amongst them, because we in our lives also are working on building a Mishkan, a temple, of bringing God into our lives, in creating a relationship with God. And we're trying to create an environment where we can bring God into our lives and have a relationship with him. But sometimes we can lose track of that. We're always creating. We're setting things up still. We're making sure we have what we need in order to do that. We have the right intentions. We have the right plan, but we never actually stop creating and building and gathering in order to actually live, to live the relationship, to live with God, and to dwell on that. The idea of Shabbos, actually, the verse says, see right here. So it says, oh no, this is not the one. It says, lost it. It says 6 days you may work and perform all your labor. All your labor? It says all your labor. You can do all your labor. And it makes it sound like you're going to finish. You can finish all your work what if I don't finish? What if I have a little bit left over when it comes to Shabbos? So the sages teach, you know what? You have to have it as if everything is done. Whether everything is done or not, someone who's committed to Shabbos says it's done. Whether it's done or it's not done, it's done. And they can go into Shabbos with that tranquility of knowing that there's nothing left to do. There's nothing to do. And that's because there's an understanding that it's time to stop building, time to stop creating, even though I was creating for a good purpose. I was creating a temple for God. I wanted to bring God into my life. So that's great. But now you have to stop. It's time to stop, to cease creating and focus on that relationship. The day of Shabbos is a day where we just focus on our relationship with God. So what are we resting from on Shabbos? What's the rest? Not just resting from work. We're resting from creating a dwelling place for God. For 6 days, we've been creating a dwelling place for God. On the seventh day, we say, now I'm going to stop creating that dwelling place, and I'm actually going to dwell with him. I'm going to be at rest. I'm going to be at ease, and I'm going to be able to focus on that relationship. Why are we resting? Are we trying to remember that God created the world, or are we trying to remember that he rested on the seventh day? And the answer is both. We're resting because we're remembering that he created the world, and that by creating the world, he created a place for us to form a relationship with him, and that we try to do the same in our lives, and that the day in which we can really focus on that is Shabbos. For 6 days we create. On the seventh day we focus on, now the creation is done, now I can dwell with him. Does God need to rest? No, he doesn't. What does it mean that he rested? It means he stopped creating. And he's teaching us to do the same. We're emulating him. Create, but then stop and dwell on it, actually engaging it. And what does the temple, the tabernacle, have to do with Shabbos? Why is our rest on Shabbos defined by refraining from the activities of the Mishkan, of building the Mishkan, because the building of the Mishkan is symbolic of the creation of the world, of God creating the world. And it's symbolic of what we strive to create in our lives. We strive to create our own tabernacle, our own place where we can bring God into our lives, a way to make God a part of our lives. And on Shabbos, though, we want to now just focus on that relationship itself. And the truth is, in a certain sense, our whole life is like this as well. The sages teach us that the Shabbos is actually an analogy for the world and life, in that this world is a preparation stage for the next world. And in the next world, we'll dwell with God. Our souls will return and dwell with God. And so we have all this time. We have all this time where we're preparing, we're building. But Shabbos reminds us of the ultimate goal. It focuses us that the goal is the dwelling with God. The goal is the relationship with God. And that's true in our life as a whole. Our life is a time to build and create and develop a relationship with God, whereby when our soul moves on, it will actually be able to enjoy that relationship in what we call, like the ultimate Shabbos after in the world to come. So that's a sort of a deeper look at what the 39 melachos, the 39 forbidding acts of Shabbos have to do with. Now, what I want to do now is take a look at the verses in the Ten Commandments and actually compare what we have in the Ten Commandments in the first time around in Exodus and Parshas Yisro with the commandments in Deuteronomy, where they appear a second time. And so when it comes specifically to Shabbos, we find a couple of differences. The first is that in Exodus, in Shemos, it says, remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. Zachar es Yom HaShabbos l'Gad, so remember. While in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, it says shamar, keep or guard the Sabbath day to sanctify it. And then it adds, as the Lord your God commanded you, which is discussed what that means. We're not going to focus on it. But so the first difference is remember and keep. And then we have a major difference after when it tells you the reason. So here in Exodus, it says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it. So like we read before, in Shemos, in Exodus, it says that the reason for Shabbos is to remember that God created the world and that he rested on the seventh day. While in Deuteronomy, it says that you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God took you out from there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord of your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. That Shabbos reminds us that we were taken out of Egypt. So a major change here in terms of the first set of the Ten Commandments and the second time they appear, which is the first time it says, it talks about remembering the creation of the world. And the second time, it talks about remembering the Exodus. So let's talk about this for the last few minutes. So the first thing we should mention is we should try to address this question. Why the change from remember the Sabbath day to keep the Sabbath day? So there's what we call the pshat answer, and then there's the deeper answer. So the most simple answer, actually, before we do that, the most simple answer is that the word zachar means remember. It's like remember something that happened a long time ago, right? So in the first commandments where we talk about the creation of the world, so then we talk about remember, zachor, because we're talking about something that happened a long time ago. They're in the desert, but they're remembering Shabbos. They're using Shabbos to remember the creation of the world. So therefore we use the word zachor, remember. The reason why in the second time the Ten Commandments are mentioned, we use the word shamor, which is guard or keep. So then we're trying to remember something that happened very recently, just 50 days earlier when they left Egypt. So then, or if you understand that the second set of 10 commandments were repeated later, 40 years later, but it's still recent history, 40 years. So therefore it's shamor, it's guard this, keep this Shabbos, which reminds us of the Exodus, which only just happened, either again, depending on when this happened, 50 days ago or 40 years ago. That's what I would call the pshat, the most simple reading. Rashi quotes from the sages, from the Talmud and the Midrash, the following, a different answer. Why does it say, he's commenting on the word shamor, keep, in the second set of commandments. So he says, when the first set of the 10 commandments, it says, remember the Sabbath day. Remember, not keep, not guard, remember. The explanation is, both of them were spoken simultaneously as one word and were heard simultaneously. That shamor and zachor and shamor were said simultaneously. You may be familiar with the words from Licha Dodi, Friday night prayers, shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. That means shamor, guard, and zachor, and remember, were b'dibur echad, were in one statement, were said together. They were said simultaneously. So what we have to understand is why. Why wouldn't they? What are these two things, first of all? What is the difference between zachor and shamor? Because essentially what it's saying is they're two different things. But they were said, otherwise, why didn't you say both? Just say one, right? So they were said simultaneously, so they have different meanings. But for some reason, it was fitting that they be said at the same time. So why? What are the two meanings? And why were they said at the same time? So we'll offer basically 1.5 approaches to this. So first of all, as we mentioned, so when it says zachor, remember, that's where it talks about that Shabbos is remembering the creation of the world. When it says shamor, guard, that's when we talk about that Shabbos is commemorating the Exodus. Now, another important piece of that we have to keep, that we should know, is that zachor means remember it. So how do we remember it? What does that mean? So what we understand this to mean actually is it refers to the positive acts of Shabbos. So kiddush, sanctifying the day. Zachar means remember it, sanctify the day of Shabbos. Zachar in Hebrew actually, it's Zachar et Yom HaShabbat l'kadesho, to sanctify it. So remember it to sanctify it. How? By making kiddush. Sanctifies the day of Shabbos. So the idea is that when Shabbos, in terms of Shabbos as the day that commemorates creation, so how do we commemorate that God created the world? That's where the holiness of Shabbos comes from. Where does the holiness come from? It's because God created the world and rested on that day. That's why the day is holy, because it's the day that God rested. So we associate God resting on the seventh day with the positive commandment to instill holiness, to sanctify the day through the positive actions, through kiddush, through having festive meals. That's how we make the day holy, through the positive actions. That's how we sanctify it. The second set of 10 commandments, where it uses the word shamor, guard, and it talks about the Exodus. So we connect guarding the Shabbos to the Exodus. What does guard Shabbos mean? So we understand that to refer to all the prohibitions of Shabbos, all the actions that we have to refrain from on Shabbos. And those remind us of the Exodus from Egypt. Because what we're doing really is we're stopping working on Shabbos. So for 6 days we work, and on the seventh day we rest. What does that remind us of? It reminds us of the Exodus, where we worked and we worked and we worked. And then we were freed and we rested. So how do we remember that? That is not through sanctifying the day. Sanctifying the day won't remind us of the Exodus. But making kiddush doesn't remind us of the Exodus. Refraining from labor, from work on Shabbos reminds us of the Exodus. And so it's fitting that in Deuteronomy, in Devarim, where we talk about the Exodus, that's where we use the word shamor, to refrain. But we So now we understand there's two aspects, right? There's sanctifying it, which is because God created the world and rested on the seventh day and made it holy. So therefore we sanctify it with positive actions like Kiddush. And we understand that we also refrain from actions that commemorates the Exodus. That's Shamor. But why don't we just mention both times, right? All the other commandments in the Torah, basically, there are a few others that were said simultaneously, but in general, right, we don't say all the commandments were just said at once and you had to, separate them. No, each commandment stands alone. So why didn't God say, sanctify it and guard it separately? And in the first set of 10 commandments, it could say, Zachar, sanctify it, remember it, and Shamor, and guard it. And in the second set of commandments, it could say them again, both of them. Why were they said simultaneously? So the Maharal, who actually said what I just said before, but the Maharal explains that the reason why they were said simultaneously is to teach us that you can't have one without the other. If it said them separately, so it would look like they're like separate things. But the idea is that one really brings out the other. And he says that, so Shamor, guard, is to refrain from actions, right? So he says that in order to make it fit to sanctify it, we need to refrain from work. Refraining from work on its own, though, won't sanctify it. He says, people take days off all the time. On its own, taking a day off from work, not working, isn't enough. It won't be clear that this is Shabbos. In order to make it clear, you have to not only refrain from those actions, but you also have to sanctify it through Kiddush, etc. Remember the Shabbos. But the other way also, it's not enough simply to just sanctify the Shabbos, because it's not, you could say it's Shabbos today, right? And sanctify it and make Kiddush. But if it's not a different day, and we do everything the same otherwise, and we don't refrain from anything, then we didn't really sanctify it. So these two things are tied together. You need both of them to really have Shabbos. If you just refrain from work, but you don't sanctify it, so it could be like a weekend, a Sunday, just taking the weekend off. You sanctify it. That makes Shabbos. But if you sanctify it, but you don't take a break from, and you don't refrain, so then what are you sanctifying? There's nothing unique about it. There's nothing special about the day. So that's why they had to be said at the same time in order to teach that you can't have one without the other. That's what the Maharal says. Now let's share one other idea about this, which is another approach. It's similar, but it's bringing out a different point. The other idea is actually before I tell you the other idea, I just want to mention one other question. So if we look at the 10 Commandments and we go across the aisle, which we always like to do. So across the aisle from keeping Shabbos, which is number 4, we have commandment number 9. So, right, because if this is number 4, then across we'll have number 9. And number 9 is to not bear false witness. But we find a little change. Another change between the first set of commandments and the second set. In the first set, it says, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And in the second set, it says, you shall not bear futile witness. It says, lo sa'aneh v'riacha eid shaker, false, lying, a lying witness. And here it says, lo sa'aneh v'riacha eid shav. Don't be a futile witness, which merely means like testifying something that just is meaningless or has no bearing. He stole, but he returned it. Okay, so what are you telling us about? like something that doesn't have any reason to be brought into court, don't testify. So why this change? So the Rabbi Yosef Salant explains that this change actually relates to the change of Zachar and Shamor as well. And he says as follows. He says that Zachar means to remember the Shabbos, for us to each individual to keep the Shabbos and to sanctify it. Shamor, which means to guard it, he says means to ensure that everybody guards the Shabbos. You know, if somebody gives you a possession and says, please guard this, so it doesn't just mean guard it from yourself and make sure you don't destroy it, right? If you're instructed to guard something, so we want you to guard it, everybody, it has to be guarded from everyone. It has to be protected from everyone. So when the Torah says guard the Shabbos, you and your children and your maidservant and your this and your that, right? It's telling us we have to ensure that everybody keeps the Shabbos. That's our job. And the reason he says is very fascinating. He says, why is it not enough just for me to keep the Shabbos? So let's talk about that cross in the Ten Commandments. So the Midrash teaches us, how does keeping the Shabbos relate to not bearing false witness? So the idea is very simple and very straightforward. When we observe Shabbos, the Midrash says, we are testifying that God created the world. When we don't keep the Shabbos, we're saying God didn't create the world. We're testifying that God did not create it. We're bearing false testimony and saying God didn't create the world. So that's how it relates. Right across, we have do not bear false witness. Fine, straightforward. Shabbos is a testimony that God created the world. Do not bear false witness. We understand. However, what happens if I bear witness that God created the world? Let's say I walk into a court, and not that it's relevant for a court case, but I walk into court and I say God created the world, and then someone else walks in and says God didn't create the world. So what are we left with? So we have two witnesses contradicting each other, so we have nothing. We're left with nothing, which means that my testimony that God created the world is rendered futile. I tried to testify, but it was a futile testimony. So the Torah tells us shamor. It says guard the Shabbos. Don't just keep it yourself. Keep it with everyone else. Everybody we should make sure, we should inspire, we should teach, we should try to have that everybody keeps the Shabbos. And you know why? Because if you want to testify that God created the world, well, you can't have others at the same time testifying that God didn't create the world. So now we understand the other change in the Ten Commandments. Because in the first set of the Ten Commandments, it says, remember the Shabbos, meaning each individual sanctify the Shabbos, and don't bear false witness. And those are very much connected. We have if keep the Shabbos, testify that God created the world, and don't bear false witness that God didn't create the world. But then we have guard the Shabbos. Ensure that everybody keeps the Shabbos. You know why? So that your testimony that God created the world isn't futile. And that's why when it comes and it says, do not bear witness, it doesn't say false witness. It says, don't bear futile witness. Because at that point, in terms of the Shabbos aspect of it, it's teaching us that we got to all keep it together. We got to all keep it together in order that we're all testifying that God created the world in 7 days, and that one person's testimony isn't rendered futile by the second person. Okay, so just to wrap up very quickly, what we learned today, we learned a lot, but we learned that the reason that the restrictions, the prohibitions, really the atmosphere that's created by Shabbos is derived from the building of the Mishkan, because we're emulating God. Just as God created the world, created a place for us to dwell, and then resting on the seventh day, we emulate God by creating him a Mishkan, a temple. But on the seventh day, we rest from that type of creation of creating a world for God. And the reason is you have to seize at some point. God stops creating the world because now it's time to dwell in that world. It's time to start developing that relationship. And so throughout the week, we're creating an environment for ourselves where we can create the temple in which God will dwell. But at some point, we have to live it. We have to dwell in it. We have to focus on it. We have to focus on that relationship. That's the special day of Shabbos. And we saw that there's differences in the two sets of commandments. The first set of commandments says, remember the Shabbos. It's the positive commandments of Shabbos. That helps us sanctify the Shabbos because it's the special day that relates to the creation of the world. It's the day that God rested, which made it holy. And the second set of commandments, it says shamor, it says guard, which either refers to the negative commandments of Shabbos, because we're remembering the Exodus at that point. We're saying refrain from work on Shabbos to remember the Exodus. You're no longer working. Or shamor means guard the Shabbos. Ensure that everyone guards the Shabbos in order that our testimony that God created the world is not futile, and that we're all testifying together to the creation of the world. Okay, we'll stop there, and I'll try to address the different questions that came up in the chat.